show and welcome to our Friday video. Today I'm going to show you how to assemble one of these granny square halter tops. These take 5 granny squares. They're all identical in size, shape, and design. You can use any design you want. I've got some good ones linked in the description box down below. It ties in the back at the neck and down below at the waist. It's a very flexible pattern, so if you've never made a top before and you're worried about it fitting, don't be. This is just about as easy as it gets. So today I'm going to show you how to assemble it, how to add a border, how to add ties, and most importantly, we're going to talk about how to measure and make sure you've got the right sized granny squares. And it's not nearly as difficult as it might sound. I actually put off making one of these because I thought it was going to be more complicated than it was. And other than making the granny squares, having this thing put together took me probably less than an hour. So if you know how to make a granny square and you want a cute top for your next beach vacation or possibly music festival, this is the tutorial for you. So you're going to see me bounce between the craft table and here in front of the camera today as I explain sizing and measurements and how it should feel and look. And we're just going to have a lot of fun. So let's grab our hooks, we're going to grab our yarn, some granny squares, we'll head on over to the craft table and let's get started stitching up a granny square halter top together. In order to make your granny square halter tops, you want 5 identical granny squares. We're going to talk sizing in a moment, but you're going to want 5. You can use any granny square pattern that you like, so long as you can easily upsize it. And typically that is a granny square that has that shell stitch row for at least some of its design, if not most of it. I used our circle centered granny square for this just to give it a little bit of interest. And of course, I used a self-striping yarn for fun. And you can use any color you want. You can make it a solid color like my white one. You can use multiple colors. You can change up the colors of your granny square, kind of like the one we did with the circle-centered granny. I'll link that tutorial down below, and there's a photograph of it here so you can see what I'm talking about. If you need larger squares, you just keep repeating that last row for increasing, and if you need smaller squares, you just don't make them as large. I used a size 4 medium weight yarn. This is a mostly cotton, somewhat acrylic blend, so 60% cotton, 40% acrylic, a blend. It's a size 4 medium weight, and I used a smaller hook. I used a 4.5 millimeter, also known as a size 7. Pair of scissors, a yarn needle. You're going to find a measuring tape is extremely useful for this project because this is a clothing project and you want to make sure your measurements are relatively accurate. You can also use a DK or a size 3 weight yarn. You can use 3 strands of a crochet thread held together. I did that for the white one that you've seen me in. And that one I would just advise maybe if you're a little more familiar with crocheting, because those little threads can kind of cut into your fingers. They can be a little bit annoying. So if this is your first time making a granny square top, I would go with a nice soft cotton or a cotton acrylic blend, something that feels nice on your skin, and just go with the simple weight category, a 3 like a DK or a 4 like a medium weight. There are 2 ways to measure your granny squares to make sure they fit for your halter top. The first one is useful if you're just making it for yourself, and the second one is very handy if you're making it for someone else. So the first thing you want to do is make a granny square. Just start, make one that you think will cover off most of one breast, and you hold it up against yourself. You want one point to fit in your sternum, in between your breasts, the other point to kind of fit right where maybe a strap would finish on a tank top or a bikini or a bathing suit. What you're looking for is a fairly decent coverage of this area. So one point in the sternum, the other point roughly where your strap would finish. Don't worry if you've got gravity pulling the girls out a little bit below one side or the other, because you're going to have granny squares down there. This is the shape we're looking for right now. Once you get a granny square that fits this area, so sternum to bottom of strap comfortably, you make 4 more exactly that size. So if you're making a granny and you hold it up and it's a bit small, it doesn't quite reach that area yet, add another row. Try it again. Still too small? Add another row, try it again. So this way you don't have to worry about a specific gauge, a specific hook, a specific yarn weight. You just start making a granny square with the hook and the yarn that you have that you like, and you keep holding it up until it suits that area. Then you make 4 more exactly that way, and then you've got exactly the perfect size granny square, 5 of them, for your particular halter top. The second way to do it is with an actual measuring tape. So you take your measurement or whoever you're making it for and you measure all the way around the widest part of the chest area. You don't have to hold it tight, you don't have to hold it loose, this is a flexible measurement, but you want kind of a general circumference measurement. So let's say for the sake of argument it's 36 inches. You take that circumference, you divide it by 4. So 36 divided by 4 is 9. It doesn't matter if you've got like a 9.3333 or 10.2 or any, it doesn't matter what the actual quarter measurement is, because the quarter measurement is the target measurement. Target doesn't have to be exact, but that measurement, that quarter measurement of the circumference, is what translates to this measurement from point to point on the granny square. So you just start crocheting a granny square and you keep turning it into a diamond configuration and measuring from point across to point. And once you hit that quarter measurement target, so let's say your quarter measurement is 9 inches. If you're at 8.75, that's fine. You don't want to add another row because that'll be too big. If you're at 9.25, that's fine. Being a little bit big is okay because this is a flexible pattern. So you take the circumference measurement, divide it by 4, and that quarter measurement is what that diamond corner to corner, so across the middle, point to point, that is where the quarter measurement is measured to. And you want to aim for it. Doesn't have to be exact, you just want to aim for it. Once you get that measurement, cross that point to point on a diamond, then you make 4 more exactly like that one, and you've got your 5 grannies. The next thing you're going to do after you have all 5 of your identically sized granny squares is lay them out in this configuration. It's basically a zigzag. This is going to be the middle front. So this is what covers your solar plexus. These cover each breast and these ones wrap around the back. So you want to think of it like that. Up here on these 2 corner top edges is where ties that go around your neck will be anchored. And on these 2 corner edges, so right over here at the back on this one and over here on this one, are where your back ties, the ties that come around your waist, will be anchored. This will be your middle. So if you're using different colored grannies like me, lay them out before you attach them and decide sort of where you want those colors. If they're all one color, it absolutely does not matter. You only have these 4 seams to worry about. So you can actually stitch them all together in a single line, like unending. Start here, stitch this seam, continue up here, continue down here, continue up here. You can sew or single crochet or slip stitch. You could use a zigzag method if you wanted something a little bit more open. Or if you're going to sew, use the whip stitch or the ladder stitch. I've got links to all 5 of those suggestions in the description box down below. So if you need to see kind of how the whip stitch or the ladder stitch or any of the joining of squares using those slightly different techniques looks, then you can check out those tutorials. You can also just seam together 2 squares at a time, making sure that when you finish with a seam, you lay it back down, keeping this configuration in front of you so that you don't accidentally stitch together 2 squares in the wrong place, or, accidentally stitch together 2 squares in the wrong configuration. So you can do them 1 seam at a time if you want, or 1 continuous seam if you're more comfortable with sewing and crocheting through corners. I've opted for the ladder stitch on my particular squares. And like I said, I've got a better tutorial down below on how to do the ladder stitch if you've never done that before, and that's kind of the option you want to go with. It's useful if you're using different colored squares like I am, because it's largely an invisible stitch. And it's not that tricky to do, especially if you do it flat on your work surface. But I wanted to show you what it looks like when you get to a seam. So no matter what joining tutorial you might be using, whether you're sewing them together or single crocheting or stitching them together, you want to finish a seam. So I've got 2 squares neatly put together now, and I've reached sort of the end of that seam. You want to lay your squares back down and make sure that they are in the correct configuration, so that when you go to continue with the next seam, you can fasten off if you're more comfortable doing that, or you can just lay them down, make sure that the configuration hasn't changed, and then pick up the next 2 and continue stitching or sewing from that corner. So you see you're ready to go. I'm going to continue with my ladder stitch, and I'm just going to start now in the new square. I'm going to get a couple of rungs in. making sure I go through the inside of the stitch there. Got a couple of rungs on this ladder stitch put together, and then I will sort of pull it tightly just to make sure that everything kind of comes through from that corner nicely. And if your corners don't all match up nice and neat and tidy, don't worry about it. If you've got a little bit of gapping or a bit of looseness in your corners because you're slip stitching through here or single crocheting or whip stitching, it doesn't matter if your corners are a little tight or a little loose, because we're going to be adding a little border, and that border will just smooth off the edges on all of our squares, and it'll neaten up the inside corners and the outside corners too. So just worry about making sure that your squares are all firmly attached in the correct configuration, and that's all you need to worry about. Don't worry about super neatness, because the border is going to clean up all of those edges. Once you've sewn or stitched together your squares in the correct configuration, and again, you could do them seam by seam or all in one seam like I did, make sure that you make your last knot or that last end of the seam a nice decent knot. If you're crocheting, you just fasten off like you normally would. If you're sewing, maybe just give it an extra little knot to make sure it doesn't want to go anywhere, and then weave in your tails. You definitely want to weave your tails in just to get them out of the way, but don't worry if it's like not the super neatest of endings, because you're going to be putting on a border and that's just going to smooth everything out. I'm going to weave my tails in on the back here, and then we're going to try it on. Alright, you've got all your squares stitched together in the proper configuration. And again, don't sweat the stitching, just get those seams together. They don't have to be perfect, they just need to be firm enough that they're not going to fall apart. And don't worry about your corners, because we're going to put on a border and that's just going to smooth everything out. Now you want to sort of try it on. Remember, you can adjust the straps on this halter top. So you can wear it a little lower, you can wear it a little higher, and it's going to pull around the back. So most importantly, it's great at first if those squares do not meet in the back, because you want to have a little bit of gap, maybe a lot, for your ties to actually tie up and create that cinching tension around the waist. That's what gives this a little bit of shape underneath the breast. So it's best if your squares do not meet in the back. If they do, qui sera sera, but it's better to err on the side of a little bit smaller, and remember that this stretches a bit, but that's what the ties are for. This is an open back halter top, and mine, that white one I wear, started out where they didn't match, and now they do actually meet in the back when I have it all tied together, because these things stretch out on you. If you wash them in cool water, no matter what the fiber is. Wash them in cool water, either a gentle cycle or a hand wash, and then lay them flat to dry. And don't stretch them unless you feel it's a bit too tight on you, because you want it to snug up a little bit after every washing. You want it to tighten up, kind of like your jeans. You know, when you put your jeans on after the wash, they're like a little difficult to get into, but then they actually loosen up a little bit. You want your halter top to be similar. You want it to be just a little bit snug when you first put it on, and then it'll loosen up with wear. But they will stretch because they're grannies, and we're using them on the diagonal. So you've got them together. It suits, it fits. Remember, you can change the tying of it. Let's put the border on now. Borders and ties. So the ties at the top that go around our neck and the ties at the side that go around our back are all done at the same time as adding the border. So this is one row that pretty much finishes off the entire halter top. We're going to start with our yarn and a slip knot, and we're going to start with tie number 1. This is one of the lower ties. We are starting in the bottom corner. I'm right-handed. I'm working right-handed. If you're left-handed, you might want to start over here, but it doesn't really matter. But we're going to start in a corner and work our way up to the top of the first upper tie. So if you're left-handed, remember you're going to be working upright. So we're starting in the bottom corner. In that chain 2 corner, or whatever the corner space is on that bottom lower square, we're going to join our yarn with a slip stitch, and we're going to start chaining. These ties are all a series of chains and then slip stitches all the way back. So the ties are going to take you a little longer than the border itself, but you're going to aim for 45 centimeters or 18 inches. Your ties can be any number of chains. It really doesn't matter. I'm going to sort of crochet out to 45 centimeters, and I'll let you know how many chains that works out for me, so you have a target to aim for. But you can make them as long or as short as you like. Just remember, these are the bottom ties. These tie around the back, and I recommend 45 centimeters or 18 inches at the least for an adult. And you can make them longer, but if you do make them a different number than me, which is perfectly fine, just write it down so you know to do the other side the exact same number. Without stretching, I've chained 81, and that gives me a definite 45 centimeter or 18 inch tie. That's without stretching. And a little over is fine, because when you slip stitch all the way back, it will make a slightly thicker, slightly tighter tie, and you want it to be flexible enough that you can tie it in a knot or a bow. We're going to skip the first chain from the hook and slip stitch into the second chain. We're going to slip stitch into each chain all the way back to the space that we started in. Once you've chained and then slip stitched all the way back, you can sort of give it a tight sort of yank just to make sure that everything smooths itself out, and you should have an 18 inch or 45 centimeter long tie at the least. If you want them longer, you can certainly make them longer, but however many chains it takes you to get there, write it down so that when you go to make your other 3 ties, they're all identical. That brings us back here, back to that corner space. This is the bottom corner space of the bottom square. We're looking at the right side of our halter top. You want to slip stitch back into that corner space. Now we're going to do a little simple scallop all the way around our entire halter top as we add in our ties. This little scallop is cute. It kind of smooths out the edges, and it hides any of the bumps that you might have from, say, uneven stitching or the joining. Like I said, a little border kind of goes a long way to help cover all those little oopsies. It's a very simple scallop. You start with a slip stitch in a corner. You find the middle stitch of a shell. That's assuming you used a shell stitch all the way across. If you didn't use a shell stitch, you just skip a stitch from the corner, find the next stitch, and work 3 double crochets into it. Skip a stitch and then slip stitch into the space. If it's not a space, you can slip stitch into the stitch. Now, if you don't want to do a little simple scallop all the way along, you can do a solid single crochet or a solid half double crochet stitch pattern all the way around your halter. Just make sure you're putting a stitch in every single stitch and space, if you have any, in between your shells. You will have corner spaces because it's a granny square, so you can always single crochet into the space or half double crochet if that's what you're using. Put in your tie if necessary, and then continue with the pattern. So if you don't want to do the scallop, you just put a stitch in every single stitch and or space all the way along. And that's if you did a granny square that doesn't have like a shell stitch edging. If you're doing if you used a granny square that is just solid double crochet, like the one we've got linked down below, then you would just, from the corner, skip a stitch, 3 double crochet, skip a stitch, slip stitch into the next stitch. Skip a stitch, 3 double crochet, I'm working over top of my short tail, skip a stitch, and then slip stitch into the space or next stitch, whatever might be there. So this little scalloped edge will work across any granny square, and you can sort of cheat or sneak in slip stitches anywhere you need to. So it's slip stitch, skip a stitch, 3 double crochet, skip a stitch, slip stitch, skip a stitch, 3 double crochet, skip a stitch, slip stitch. Let's do another one. Skip a stitch, 3 double crochet into the next stitch. I think I'm going to leave that rest of that tail out and I'll worry about it later. Come here, you. Out of my way. Skip a stitch, 3 double crochet into the next stitch. If it's a shell you're looking at, it's the middle stitch always. skip a stitch, slip stitch into the chain space or the next stitch. If you did a shell stitch edging that doesn't have chain 1 spaces in between, you're just slip stitching into the space between your shells. So this pattern will still work even if you don't have a chain 1 space, you will have spaces between your shells. Skip a stitch, 3 double crochet into the next stitch. Skip a stitch, slip stitch into the space, and so on. You're just going to work away at that until you get to this top corner. So remember, you're going across the seam. When you get to the seam, I'll show you what that looks like there too. When you get to a seam between squares as you're working the border, you have 2 options. If you have a very short amount of space between stitches, like let's say you didn't use a great big chain 2 corner, or your work is a little tighter or something, then you can do your slip stitch into the seam. So you would skip the corner space, which is here, slip stitch into the seam, skip the next corner space, and then also that next stitch, and then continue with the pattern of 3 double crochet in the middle stitch of the shell. And it would look like this. If that doesn't pull your work too tightly, you can do that. If it does pull your work too tightly, so let's say your work is a little looser, maybe you used a zigzag join or a single crochet join, when you get up to that edge, you finish with your last little scallop anchored in the middle shell, you slip stitch into the corner space, and you work 3 double crochet into the middle of the seam. So just grab anything in the middle of the seam, work your 3 double crochet directly into the top of the seam. If you have really messy seam edges, this is also a good choice. And then you immediately slip stitch into the corner space. So you're looking for the next corner space of the next square, and you slip stitch there. And that will not make your work too tight. And then you just continue, skip a stitch, 3 double crochet into the next stitch, which is the middle of the shell of the next square, and so on. So if you have looser squares, if you have messy seam edges, and you want them covered, you're going to work that little scallop right into the seam, and you're going to plant the slip stitches in the corner spaces on either side of it, and continue. If your work is a lot tighter, you can skip the seam altogether by putting, so you work your last scallop, and instead of putting that slip stitch in the corner space, you would plant it right in the edge of the seam, and then skip the corner space, skip the next stitch, and start the pattern again with a little scallop in the middle stitch of the next shell. And that is if you've got kind of loose stitching, maybe your work isn't as sort of stretched out. Try both and see what you think. Lay it down. If it lies flat, it's good. If you really want to cover that seam, then I recommend doing the little scallop over top of it. Otherwise, you can skip it and just put the slip stitch in there. And you would do the same thing for each seam all the way around. There's no right or wrong here, so whatever you feel looks best for your halter top, that's the option you go with. You've worked that little scallop pattern now all the way up to the top of the top square. So remember, this is where our 2 upper ties are going to be anchored. So you finish with that last little scallop, slip stitch into the top corner space of that upper square, and you make another tie. So this is lower tie number 1. Now you're going to make upper tie number 1, and I recommend doing the same number of chains because you really don't need shorter ties up top. You want nice long ties, maybe a nice big bow. You certainly don't want to be pressed for tie space. You want nice long comfortable ties that you can tie a bow with or a cute little knot, so that you can have those ties sort of running down the back of your neck long enough so that you can grab them to untie it if you need to. So I recommend making all of your ties the same length. And I'm going for 45 centimeters or 18 inches. I'm chaining 81. I chained out 81 and did exactly as I did for the first tie. Skip the first chain, slip stitch into every chain all the way back. That brings me back to the same space that I left. This is the top corner space up here. So I slip stitch into that. And I continue with that little scallop pattern. Skip a stitch, find the next stitch, it'll be the middle of a shell. 3 double crochet into the middle of that stitch. skip a stitch, slip stitch into the next, which is the chain 1 space. And I'm going to continue that all the way down to this inside corner, and I'll meet you there. You've worked that little scallop stitch all the way down the inside edge now of the top front. Whenever you get to an inside corner, so this is a corner where you've got 3 squares meeting. So you've got 1 up top and 2 down here at the bottom. All you're going to do is this. We're going to slip stitch those 3 spaces together. It is so neat and tidy. You're going to pick up a loop in that first corner space. Pick up a loop in the next corner space. Remember, these are 3 squares intersecting. And pick up a loop in the last corner space. So you'll have 4 loops on your hook. Try to keep a little bit of tension on them. Take that last loop and just pull it back through everything. And you've just slip stitched those 3 spaces together, and you've made the edge of that seam so neat and tidy. So even if it was a complete disaster, when all 3 of your squares came, maybe you had a gap, maybe it was a bit out of whack, slip stitch all 3 of those spaces together and you get a beautiful, neat and tidy edge to it. Then you just continue with that scallop pattern. You're going to skip a stitch, work 3 double crochet into the next stitch, skip a stitch, slip stitch into the space or the next stitch, whatever happens to be staring at you. And you just repeat that little scallop pattern all the way up here. You put in upper tie number 2 that will match this tie here. So you slip stitch into the space, chain 81, slip all the way back, slip stitch into that space. Work the same scallop pattern all the way down this side that you did over here. So if you covered over that seam with a scallop, you do the same thing over there. If you only slip stitch into that seam, you do the same thing over here, just so they match. You're going to get down to this corner and you're going to repeat for the first lower seam or the lower tie that you started with. So you slip stitch into that corner, chain 81 or however many chains you're using, slip stitch all the way back, slip stitch into here, scallop. And this is where I'm going to meet you. So this is going to be the first little corner that we didn't put an actual tie in. You've got 3 of these along the bottom. So I will meet you all the way back down here. When you finish your last scallop and you're entering that last corner, remember you've got 3 outside corners down the bottom. You've got 2 inside corners. These guys will be those slip stitch 3 spaces together. Here's what we're going to do in the outside corners. You're going to slip stitch into the corner, chain 2 and slip stitch into the same corner space, and all that does is give it a nice neat little finish. So finish that scallop, slip stitch, chain 2, slip stitch into the outside corner, continue your scallop stitching all the way along to the inside corner. That gets slip 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 3 spaces together, scallop up to the outside corner, slip, chain chain, slip into the outside corners. You're going to do that all the way along the bottom. And I will meet you back up here at upper or lower tie, I should say, number 1, and we'll fasten off. When you get all the way back around to that first tie where you started, you're going to finish your last scallop and slip stitch into the same chain 2 space that the whole thing began in. Fasten off and leave a fairly long tail of yarn, because there's a lot in this border and you don't want this thing to come unraveling on you. So leave a long tail and take care to weave in all of your ends, making sure you go first one way under a bunch of stitches like this. And then double back and go back through the same stitches, and do this several times to make sure that your tails don't want to come undone. The last thing you might want to do is just go around and take every single one of those little scallops and kind of just poke them to the front, give them a little pull. I find that this helps kind of do a little bit of basic hand blocking. You may wish to wash this first and block it, or let it lay flat to dry. If you're going to hand wash it, use cool water and a little bit of light detergent, and you can also put it in the washing machine on a gentle cycle, but depending on the fiber you used, I recommend checking out the label of your yarn just to double check that there aren't any special washing instructions. And there you go. You can tie it on, adjust it a little higher or a little lower depending on your preference. I get the neck one tied up first, and then I tie the back nice and snug, and then I readjust the top one just to sort of decide where I want it to sit up or down. And you can tie it a little snugger in the back to give it a little bit more shaping. And there you go, a halter top. And can I just reiterate that this looks really cute underneath a jacket too, whether it's a blazer or a jean jacket. So there are more places than just the beach or a music festival that you can wear one of these, so long as you have a nice little lacy blouse or a cami or just a simple tank top underneath. So yeah, have fun. Oh, and if you're making this for a young girl or someone who's young at heart, may I suggest some of these super cute little 6-inch granny squares that we have over in our Etsy shop. They are little faces like a bear or a frog or a bright sunshine or a pretty little flower, and they would make adorable little squares for this particular granny square halter. And you can make them bigger just by repeating that simple shell stitch border edge around and around. So if you need them a little bit bigger than 6 inches, or you're using a different yarn and a smaller hook, you can vary the size of those patterns easily too, just by repeating that last row until it's as big as you need. So I think this would look really cute with little suns or little flowers in the center of the granny squares as well, especially if you're making it for somebody who's on the younger side. And if you want to pick up one of those patterns, you'll find the link to our Etsy shop down below. And since you're here, use promo code CUTEHALTER, all one word, in the promo code checkout at your checkout, and you'll get 10% off any of those cute little granny squares that I mentioned. And that's a little thank you for watching the whole tutorial and sticking through to the end. So if you make one of these yourself, I would love to see you in it, or just a picture of it on your workspace if you're kind of shy. You can share photos at our Etsy shop as well. Just scroll down the page until you see message seller. Click on that, click on the little camera icon button or the little landscape picture that's inside your message box, and you can add a photograph, and I would love to see it. Until then, I hope you enjoyed working on this along with me today. We will see you soon here on the Jayda InStitches Show. Have a wonderful week. Stay safe, stay crafty, and we'll see you soon. Bye, guys.
Hi, everybody. Mr. InStitches here. Thank you for watching today. Here are some of our other videos you might be interested in. Oh, and don't forget to subscribe.